Hello, welcome and thank you for joining our second public engagement session for the draft strategic mobility plan. This is an opportunity for city staff to hear from you. Before we get started, I want to go through a few quick housekeeping items. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded so that we can post it to the city's website following the meeting. During this engagement session, our goal is to collect feedback from our community, and we will answer as many questions as we can live. Anything we're unable to answer due to time limitations will be posted on the Strategic Mobility Plan's webpage at charlottenc.gov/SMP. Following a brief presentation, we'll move into a period for questions and answers or comments. When it's time for the open discussion, you can sign up by using the raise your hand feature. The raise your hand icon is under the reactions button on your screen. It looks like a high five. Staff will keep a list of who is next to speak, and when it's your turn, we will call your name and you will be unmuted. At any time, feel free to ask questions in the chat window. Questions in the chat will come directly to the host of the meeting and I will relay them to the panel. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelist. To my left is Julian Burton, a transportation planner with the Charlotte Department of Transportation. Next to Julian is Ed McKinney, Deputy Director for the Charlotte Department of Transportation. Next to Ed is Jason Lawrence, Director of Planning for the Charlotte Area Transit System. And I'm Hannah Bromberger, Strategic Mobility Division Manager for the Charlotte Department of Transportation. With that, I'll turn it over to Ed McKinney to kick off an overview presentation of the Strategic Mobility Plan.
Thank you, Hannah. Again, I'm Ed McKinney with the Charlotte Department of Transportation, and I just want to thank everyone for being here today and giving us your time. We're really excited to share some of the ideas on this plan and really have a good engaged discussion here this afternoon. What I'll do is just give a little bit of background, set the stage for this plan. I'll turn it then over to Julian, who will walk through some more of the details of the draft plan, and then we'll open it up for discussion and comment and questions. What I want to start with is the foundation for this plan. So about a year ago, the city of Charlotte adopted their 2040 comprehensive plan. It was a major effort, a complete new sort of a full, sorry about that. We just wanted to check. It looked like we were getting just a little bit of feedback. So again, the foundation for this is the 2040 comprehensive plan adopted about a year ago. And so again, this was a really dramatic kind of rethink and update of the city's vision for how we plan for growth and think about the future of our city long term. That plan had 10 goals, and what we want to do is focus on the fifth goal, which was safe and equitable mobility. So the foundation for everything we're doing in the strategic mobility plan really starts with the comprehensive plan. That goal was, as it's described here, really focused around safe and equitable mobility. It essentially had a series of objectives that Julian will talk about in more detail, but the foundation again is around making sure that everything we do from a policy and investment standpoint is focused on ensuring that we have safe and equitable mobility. What does that mean? And really, what are our aspirations around those two visions? And so on the safe, from a safe perspective, we're really building upon the work that we have done over the last few years around this notion of Vision Zero. And that concept is the idea that we want to do everything we can to eliminate traffic deaths and serious injuries on our streets. And that this is a program that's national, really thinking about everything we can do to work with our partners, sort of extend our education around how to behave and be safe on our streets, and then again investment that we can do to make sure that we're building streets and updating our streets to be as safe as possible. On the equitable side, this is sort of one of the big new things that you'll see in this plan, and we'll describe a little bit more, which is this notion about shifting the way we move. And so it's this goal of 50-50 mode share. And so it's a little bit of a wonky concept, but the idea is, how do we balance the way we move and essentially get out of our cars and have an infrastructure and a system in place that makes it easier and more comfortable to use other modes? Again, we'll talk about the details of that, but it means really shifting from single occupancy vehicles. Today, that's about 3/4 of how we get around and move through our city, and really shift that to really only being half the trips we make. Big investments in transit, big investments in new thinking around our bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure are really going to be a big part of that. Ultimately, it's about creating new capacity, but again, for us, it's being equitable. We have many households in our city that don't even have the ability to own a car and move on our system by vehicle. And so for us, making sure that we balance that investment is really a way to be equitable, to be sustainable, and ultimately it's just managing our infrastructure. We simply can't build and invest in enough vehicular capacity to really manage the growth that we're envisioning over the long term. Our history is a big part of that. And so, we've gone through an evolution of an early city that was just around the crossroads of Trade and Tryon and the early development of our city, through a period of major growth in the 20th century, where we built and successfully created an infrastructure with highways and connectivity that connected us nationally, connected us to the region, and created a sort of a framework for how we would get around our city through roads, again, highways and freeways. Where we are today, though, is we're really moving in a 21st century notion of being a much more multimodal city. So we're all familiar with the investment we made in the Blue Line and our transit system long term. We've gone through some major thinking about creating complete streets and building our street infrastructure to be more multimodal. And so what this plan does is begin to build even more on that. You'll see some of those ideas as we move forward today about truly thinking about our city in a much more multimodal way. The last thing I'll say, and again, this probably goes without saying for our community, is we are just growing so fast that the way we think about mobility simply has to change. Not only in terms of population and job growth, but as you see from this diagram, just the sheer geography of our city has expanded pretty dramatically over the last 50, 60 years. And so for us, making sure and providing all sorts of new ways to think about how we move is really just fundamental. And essentially, we have no choice. We have to be thinking about our infrastructure in completely new ways to be successful and prosperous as a city long term. Last thing, just the notion of what that means and what we're building on from a community voices standpoint. What are we hearing from our community? Again, we were building upon some great engagement with the 2040 plan, but we've done some other things to essentially engage us about how what are the desires of our community. We got some really strong feedback that many of us in our community are looking for new ways to get around. We did that sort of holistically with surveys, but as you can see from this map, we also gained some very specific, site-specific ideas, questions, concerns, and we're building upon and taking all that information and essentially has shaped the specifics and direction of this draft plan. So with that, that's the foundation, a little bit of background. I'll turn it over to Julian to just walk through some more of the details of the plan.
Thanks, Ed. Again, I'm Julian Burton. I'm a transportation planner with Charlotte Department of Transportation. That was a really good explanation of kind of the foundation of what this plan is and how we kind of put it together. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about how we're going to move forward to try and achieve our aspirational goals related to safe and equitable mobility. So one of the things that this plan does is establishes a new policy framework. And that's going to help guide and direct our partnerships, decisions that we're making daily or larger decisions as well, and also our investments. And this framework also consolidates and updates all of our existing mobility policies from our existing plans like the Transportation Action Plan, Charlotte Walks, Charlotte Bikes. And it takes all of those and puts them in one place while aligning them with our new aspirational goals from the comprehensive plan. This policy framework will also help make a connection between our long-range aspirational goals and the specific steps necessary that we'll need to make to achieve those goals. Our policies are organized by the 6 objectives that come out of Goal 5 of the Charlotte Future Comprehensive Plan. Those are safe, connected, equitable, sustainable, innovative, and prosperous. So as you can imagine, there is a lot of information within this chapter. So what I want to do is just give you a brief guide to help you navigate the chapter if you're interested in reviewing it. And we certainly will welcome comments and feedback. So we definitely want to hear what you have to say about our policies. So go ahead and go online and make those comments as well. So here's just an example of a page out of the policy chapter. This is focused on our objective SAFE. So when you're looking at this, SAFE is that overarching objective that aligns with the comprehensive plan. And then under the objective, there's going to be several different policies. Here, this example is to create safe streets for all users. And basically, those policies are providing some general context and direction that are going to help us meet the objective. Under each policy, there's going to be several different strategies, and those are introducing specific initiatives. And then under each strategy, there are several actions that provide the specific steps towards implementation. So again, just a guide there. So please take a look and provide us with your comments and feedback that you have on our policies. Our policies create that strong foundation that we need to move us forward towards a safe and equitable mobility network. But what we also need is a strategy for how we're going to invest in this mobility network to try and reach that vision. So what we've done was we put together 4 different frameworks, and they're generally associated with four different modes of transportation. So you have transit, bicycle, pedestrian, and then street and roadway. And each framework assesses the needs and includes priority networks that will help us guide investment. So I want to make sure that we're going to leave time for discussion. So again, I'm going to move fairly quickly through these different frameworks, but as we're discussing after the presentation, we can definitely jump back and look more closely at any of these. So starting with transit, transit provides a foundation for a multimodal network because it really creates an opportunity for affordable options for those middle to long range transportation trips that allow you to travel outside of a single occupancy vehicle. This framework is reliant on a strong partnership between CATS, Charlotte Area Transit System, and CDOT. And the priority networks are founded on the work that CATS has already been doing on the 2030 Transit Corridor System Plan and the Bus Priority Study. So just taking a quick look, this is the adopted 2030 Transit System Corridor Plan that we're using as one of our priority networks within the transit framework. This may be familiar to some of you. There's the blue line included in this network and the gold line as well, both of which are at least partially constructed already. And it's also laying the foundation for the future transit corridors, silver line with the east-west and the red line, an extension of the blue line, and then the Charlotte Gateway Station that will be in Uptown as a multimodal transit station. The other priority network within the transit framework is the bus priority network. And what this does is focuses on expanding bus service throughout the city by providing for some high frequency service routes. And then within those high frequency service routes, also some 6 priority corridors that will include some treatments that will help buses move more efficiently along those corridors. It also calls for mobility hubs, which are centralized stop locations that align different modes of transportation. And also sets a framework for microtransit areas, which is a newer concept for more flexible on-demand transit options. The bicycle framework focuses on dramatically expanding bike and micromobility within Charlotte. So just to give you a quick definition, micromobility includes bikes, but it also would include e-scooters and e-bikes, electric skateboards. So there's a lot of emerging technology within micromobility, and we realize that by creating good and safe and accessible bicycle facilities, that we're also creating opportunities to take advantage of emerging technology options like e-scooters. So this framework is establishing the network citywide, and it also leverages the ongoing private and public investments that we've already done in bike infrastructure. So taking a look at the bicycle priority network, we use several different criteria to come up with this network, looking at areas with higher population employment density, We wanted to make sure there was strong connections for cost burden households and households with limited vehicle access, and wanting to make sure that we were making strong connections to transit. That being just basically to create some good first and last mile options for bicycles and slightly longer connections as well, to make sure that people throughout the city can either get to employment areas or safely get to transit in order to get to where they need to go. And this network also leverages, as I mentioned before, our existing investment in bicycle infrastructure, and makes a strong connection to the Mecklenburg County Greenway Master Plan, making sure that our on-street bicycle facilities are making strong connections to the off-street greenway trails. Pedestrian framework, it's a similar concept to the bicycle framework in that we're trying to make safe and accessible connections to transit and to key destinations. It supports the 10-minute neighborhoods, which is a concept coming out of the Charlotte Future Comprehensive Plan. The concept being that you should be able to get to your destination, whether that's work, whether that's a healthcare facility, whether that's school, within a 10-minute trip, including a transit trip. So similar to the bicycle network, we use several different criteria to try and identify areas that would have a need to really be able to utilize safe pedestrian facilities. So we looked at areas with proximity to centers, and that would be activity centers, kind of job creators, schools, existing greenways, again, to make those strong connections to the Mecklenburg County Greenway Plan, and then also to transit, creating those first last mile connections to the transit stops. And we also considered the areas with higher percentage of households without access to a vehicle and land uses that serve the elderly or people with disabilities. We also understand that we have a lot of gaps within our current street system and street network, especially on our larger arterial streets, which can cause a particularly dangerous situation. So when we're prioritizing projects in the future, sidewalk gaps is going to be one of the important criteria that we're looking at. And finally, our fourth framework is the street and roadway framework. This is looking at just our streets throughout the city, making sure that we're going to be taking the steps to maintain what we already have and manage our system well, looking at balancing trade-offs between different modes, taking advantage of regional investment that's coming in for our streets, looking at corridors and centers that are growing particularly fast and knowing that they're going to put an additional strain on our street network, and also creating new street connections to reduce demand on our current system. So two of the networks that were included in this framework is the New Streets network, which identifies areas where we could make a new street connection that would dramatically affect or improve our network. And then the Complete Streets network, which is identifying streets that would need additional infrastructure improvements in order to be true multimodal complete streets and not focused primarily on just moving vehicles. So all four of those frameworks, they provide us with the tools to take the next step and create a new and updated prioritization strategy. So one of the major actions following the SMP adoption will be to develop a specific methodology that will allow us to actually prioritize projects every year. So that methodology will need to balance the needs from all four of those frameworks, but also will need to be connected to our 6 overarching objectives, and we'll need to create criteria that is tied to all 6 of those objectives. So one thing that I wanted to point out is that although we do need to prioritize our investments, we're still committed to complete streets throughout the city. The Charlotte Streets Map provides the vision for all of our arterial streets and includes a multimodal cross section to ensure that we preserve the space and design our streets through private development as well as through our public investments. And that applies to our 4 types of arterial streets, kind of the hierarchy there shown on the left, the parkways, which are the larger, faster moving streets all the way down to our main streets. And the second draft of the streets map will be released on June 3rd. So if you're interested in looking more closely at our arterial cross sections, keep an eye on that, and there'll be opportunities to provide feedback on those as well. And this is just an example of one cross section that shows kind of the different components of what's going to be shown on those arterial streets. This is a 4-lane avenue and more of an urban context. There's travel lanes in the center space, the bicycle facilities, and then the planning strip and pedestrian facilities. In this case, it's actually an amenity zone, but the streetscape on the outside of the cross section. So in terms of next steps, CDOT obviously has a leading role in a lot of these actions going forward. We also have roles in maintaining our mobility assets, operating our mobility system, managing our right-of-way, and designing our mobility strategy. The planning doesn't stop here with the SMP. The SMP is creating that foundation to do some great planning work going forward. So CDOT's going to continue to be a leader in planning for mobility going forward, but we're not going to be able to do that alone. We'll be collaborating with our partners within the city. I mentioned CATS, the planning department as well. And we'll also be working with our public partners, our neighborhood groups, advocacy groups, and other governmental organizations like NCDOT. So just to provide you a little bit with some timeline here, the public draft was released on May 20th, and this is the second of our 2 virtual public engagement sessions. So thank you so much for joining us today. Going forward, there's gonna be a presentation to the council strategy session on June 6th, the council TAP committee on June 13th, and then there'll also be an opportunity for public comment to council on June 13th. So if you have some feedback or comments that you want to provide directly to council, there'll be an opportunity to do that on June 13th. And then we're hoping that the SMP will be adopted by council on June 27th. I also wanted to mention we have a couple of parallel transportation related documents that are also going through approval processes. I mentioned the streets map. The streets map actually is associated with the streets manual. So that includes information on the streets map. It also includes comprehensive transportation review, what we refer to as the CTR, which assesses development impacts on transportation and potentially gives some mitigation requirements there. And then some driveway and access rules that give guidance on how to design and place driveways. So that streets manual is going to follow the adoption schedule of the Unified Development Ordinance. So as I mentioned, that's going to be the second draft will be released for all of those documents on June 3rd. And the plan is to have a public hearing alongside the UDO on July 11th, with the hope that all of those documents would be adopted on August 22nd by the council. So I know we moved through that fairly quickly, but we wanted to make sure that we had plenty of time for questions and discussion. So if you do have any specific questions, please feel free. I think some of you have probably already done so, but go ahead and put those in the chat, and Hannah's going to help lead us through those questions to make sure that we can get to as many as we can. And it's possible that we can't get to all of them, but if we're unable to do so, we'll make sure that we follow up in some form and get you an answer.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Julian. So to kick off the questions, the first one is, how do we decide what's a priority on each street between bikes, cars, people, and transit?
That's a great question. This is Ed McKinney again, and certainly Julian can jump in on this because he described a little bit about this in his presentation. But the way I would say it is we have a sort of a complete streets approach to how we design our streets. So in many ways, again, as Julian just showed in our streets map, our vision on our arterial system is to make sure that we design it in a way that is multimodal. And so there's ways in which essentially we're designing this without having to completely prioritize one or the other. We want to make sure that we've got the right capacity for vehicles, we have the right facilities, safe and comfortable for bicycle travel, and then certainly making sure we have the right kind of pedestrian infrastructure to make it safe and walkable. And so that's the vision. Certainly, as the question implies, we do have to recognize that we do have constraints, and there are sometimes physical, environmental, and just in some ways, the kind of development constraints that happen around our streets and our roadways. And so there are places where we still are kind of having to balance trade-offs, and that'll be certainly one of the things, as Julian described, as we get deeper into some of our longer term mobility planning, looking more closely at key corridors and key developing activity centers. One of our challenges and one of the things we'll be communicating and working with the community on is, how do we balance some of the trade-offs? There are places and streets where we're going to have to reflect the design and constraint that exists. And so in some cases, we may have to modify the facilities that are in place or think about how we might prioritize one mode, not to eliminate others, but essentially design some of our streets to make sure that we're providing the right kind of mobility within the context of some pretty tricky constraints sometimes.
And I'll just add one thing. The SMP is going to create a great foundation for making those types of decisions, those difficult trade-off decisions. And it'll do that through that policy framework and then these those 4 different strategy frameworks that we've put together. But we're going to be continuing, as Ed mentioned, to plan going forward. And it's going to be, SMP is a living, breathing document. We're going to be in the future updating that regularly. We're going to be looking at that. And then the methodology that we put together to prioritize projects is going to be changing over time as we see different needs arise and different transportation technologies arise, and maybe we start focusing on different areas that we're seeing undergo a great deal of growth. So I think all those things will change over time, and we'll just need to continue to adapt and just continue to take it kind of 1 year at a time.
JL, we have a question about transit. Can you give us a little bit of an update on Providence Road and bus priority?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for the question. And as you saw on the map, there were a number of routes and thoroughfares that were indicated as part of our bus priority network. Providence Road was one of the routes that we've indicated as part of our high frequency network. We have 23 routes we've indicated as an aspirational network of routes of frequency greater than 15 minutes throughout the day. We also have 6 focus corridors where we feel are at a higher level in investment, almost approaching bus rapid transit types of investments, and that would be Central Avenue, South Tryon, some of those more higher ridership routes. In the case of Providence Road and all of our bus routes, we are looking at what we're calling bus stop balancing, going up and down the corridor and getting bus stops in the right location as it relates to signals and crosswalks and development. And all of our routes will have signal priority enabled once we get the technology worked out between our buses and the signals throughout the city of Charlotte. So although the Providence Road is not indicated as one of the focus corridors as part of the priority network, it is prioritized in the case of high frequency as well as bus stop improvements.
And I'll just jump in real quick. I mean, that's a great example. I think Julian just mentioned it briefly about the importance of what this plan does in terms of making sure that we're coordinating hand in hand with CATS. And JL just mentioned it briefly, but how we operate our signals and how we design our intersections can be done in a way that makes bus frequency, makes the comfort and efficiency of those routes even better. And so we're going to be working very closely on those focus corridors, thinking about the mobility hubs. So much of that infrastructure sort of fits within the right of way in some cases. And so we want to make sure that this plan, the mobility plan, does everything we can to kind of prioritize and really focus on that coordination to make sure that we're doing everything we can physically and operationally in our streets to support the vision that CATS and certainly the city has around making sure that we extend that bus route and network in a way that it connects all of our neighborhoods.
All right, we have another question from Alex. I'll take a stab at this one and then join in. The question is, how will the rollout of the SMP work? And is there a list of prioritized projects that accompany it? And will those projects have geographic equity? So that's a great question. What the strategic mobility plan is, it's a vision and a policy document. And so when we put it before city council, if city council approves it, then what they're telling us is that they agree that this is the vision for our streets in the city. And so as Julian touched on during the presentation, once it's adopted, we have some additional work to do to develop prioritization criteria and to develop a list of projects from there. We will certainly consider geographic equity, but the strategic mobility plan really focuses on usage and safety. And so we want to make sure that the roads that are traveled most frequently by pedestrians, by bicyclists, by cars, are as safe as they can be for each of those modes.
And, and one of the challenges to what we're trying to do, and I mentioned it in the kind of the preamble to this, is we're growing extremely fast, one of the fastest growing cities in the country. And we only have a limited set of resources. And so the needs that we have across the city compared to the resources we have means that, as Hannah described, we have to be very strategic about how we prioritize that investment. This plan tries to essentially focus in on the metrics, the criteria by which we can really move the needle. If we're going to work towards and achieve this vision of that 50-50 mode split, the only way we do that and move the needle is to really focus on the places where we can benefit the most in our community, connect them to the jobs and services they need. And it's really going to be a contingent on making sure that we provide and focus that investment that the city makes in the places that have the most impact.
The next question is about parking. And the offering parking incentivizes driving. And so are there any parking regulations being implemented through the strategic mobility plan?
Yeah, I'll start with that. It's a great question. And actually it is an important notion about things that are beyond just the investment that we make in our mobility system to get to this broader goal that we have. So certainly, we're planning and partnering real closely with the work that's going on with the Unified Development Ordinance. So if you're following that work, again, stemming from the comprehensive plan, this is a complete rewrite of all the rules, the zoning, the development regulations that are in place to guide how private development occurs. And so lots of detail in that plan around parking. And in fact, that's been a really elevated conversation with the city council recently as we're getting closer to the adoption. And so based on that UDO, there are places where we're calibrating the parking to both lower, certainly dramatically lower the maximum. So we're sort of ensuring, particularly in our high intensity places, we're not essentially we're making sure that we're not building more parking that's needed. Again, to the notion of this question that changes behavior. We're also in many key places, lowering and reducing the minimums. And so we want to make sure that we sort of get out of the way of how development is occurring in a way that supports getting people out of their cars. And in some cases, that's the way we develop is a big part of that. We also, another detail, if you're following our comprehensive transportation review guidelines, one of the key thoughts in there is to make sure that we're incentivizing multimodal investment. And so again, in some of our high intensity places like uptown or around our transit stations, we're working towards kind of a partnership on transportation demand management. And so we've got incentives there that essentially incentivize reducing parking to be part of the mitigation for development. We really do want to encourage the development around some of our high intensity places that have great access to transit, essentially to do everything they can to change the behavior and make sure that we get people out of their cars.
This is Julian Burton again. I'll just add one thing. I mean, one of the actions within the strategic mobility plan is to actually put together a transportation demand management plan as well, to kind of build off what we're doing with the CTR, but also look at some programmatic strategies, working with private employers to try and figure out ways to encourage alternative modes of transportation and also get people out of the car. So we realize that parking is kind of one piece of that puzzle, but we've got to try and kind of attack that in multiple different ways. So TDM is doing that, and then as Ed mentioned, we're very involved in what's being done in the UDO for the on-site parking requirements.
How does the strategic mobility plan complement other plans, including Connect Beyond?
That's a great question. I'll maybe start and then have JL jump in, because JL was sort of the lead on that plan, and it's again a very important part of what we're trying to do with the mobility plan. So, and again, I'll let JL talk about the kind of vision and specifics of Connect Beyond, but I would say, and you'll see this in the draft plan, we've been very intentional about making sure that we are kind of wiring what we do to the larger vision of the plan. You'll see this in the part that we describe in terms of the roadway and street strategy that Julian identified. One of the things in there is we have reflected the notion of some strategic corridors from the regional perspective. So you'll see those identified in the plan. And again, just like what we're doing with CATS on the bus priority network, we're making sure that we work hand in hand with the long-term vision of those strategic corridors to make sure that we're thinking about how they support transit and vehicular access to the region, and really become part of how we think about investment to get us not only connected internally, but think about our relationship in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ed. And for those of you that maybe weren't involved in the earlier stages of the Connect Beyond process, Connect Beyond was a regional transit plan in partnership between the Charlotte Area Transit System and the Central Atlanta Regional Council across 2 states and 12 counties. And we just wrapped up that study last year. It was adopted by the Metropolitan Transit Commission last October. And in that plan, we engaged with transit providers and DOTs across the 2 states, and really brought that effort down into like 5 strategic mobility moves: creating mobility friendly places, expanding mobility choices, strengthening rural to urban connections, build a better bus network, and invest in strategic mobility corridors. And it's really those last 2 that really were the strategic mobility plan and the Envision My Ride bus priority study really come to support that effort, because how we connect to the other transit systems can only work if we have a bus priority system, and how we invest in strategic mobility corridors will only work if we're thinking of things like strategic mobility plans. So it complements it very well, and it was very intentional coordination between the various efforts.
Does the strategic mobility plan include environmental mitigations such as street trees for heat islands or floodwater mitigation to avoid stream erosion?
So, yes, I mean, I think this is Julian Burton again. So this is again relates to that connection we have between the strategic mobility plan and the Unified Development Ordinance. So whenever new development comes in, they're going to have certain requirements, for what they're going to have to do on site, but also for what they're potentially going to have to do in the right of way. And so, for example, you're talking about street trees. So if you look at our arterial cross sections that are shown in the streets map, we're saving space or creating space within that cross section for street trees. And that's whether it's an urban environment, and that would be kind of an amenity zone, or a more suburban environment where you would be just in a traditional planning strip. So we make sure that we're creating that space, and then Unified Development Ordinance would actually be requiring the installation of those trees. And there's a whole natural resources chapter that deals with the impacts of development and making sure that stormwater is controlled from the right of way and from the site, and detained appropriately. So it sounds like what you're getting at is a lot of what's going to be done through kind of development review. And so we're supporting all of those types of requirements by making sure that trees have a space within the right of way as well.
Jason, we have a follow-up to the Providence Road question from earlier. Have we considered a dedicated bus lane from I-485 to Uptown?
Sure, good question. As mentioned before, Providence Road is one of our high frequency corridors. I think we did not specifically call out bus lane for Providence Road or for many of our corridors within our system. I think our first strategy will be to look at the placement of bus stops, utilizing signal priority to its fullest extent. Queue jumpers where possible. That's a special signal that enables a bus to get ahead of the queue of traffic. we would look at those strategies primarily system-wide, but also on Province Road before we would explore a dedicated bus lane.
It does, the other thing I'll add to that, when you look at the connection sometimes between the investment we're making in our highways and our road system regionally has some really beneficial impacts on the ability to connect us from a transit perspective. I'll maybe punt it back to JL to talk in more detail, but our managed lanes in the system, the investment we're making in partnership with NCDOT and regionally, both benefits transit and how we want to get connected from a road and highway standpoint.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that the question, part of the context was being the gateway to Union County for Providence Road. And if you think about, as Ed mentioned, that broader network of toll facilities throughout our region on 485, on 74, 77, that if you're coming from Union County, there's potential opportunities to connect along those corridors rather than coming in on Providence Road. So I think from a time standpoint, you could see benefit on those facilities rather than coming in on Providence Road. And it becomes down to the type of travel that person is going for. Is it just to get from, say, Union County to Uptown? That's a different question than somebody stopping along the way on Providence Road. So I think there's different opportunities that we'll continue to explore, and the toll facilities, express lanes are certainly the key to that strategy.
You get some great benefit, right? From our regional bus system being able to utilize those lanes has some really great regional connections and investment and efficiency that it's really connecting us in a way regionally that we've never done before.
Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about bicycle parking. Are there plans for larger scale bicycle parking along strategic corridors?
So, and I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but this is again kind of related to that relationship between the strategic mobility plan and the unified development ordinance. So generally speaking, bike parking is going to be a requirement to go on site, or at least through site development, even if it's going to be located within the right of way. And so the SMP very much supports those requirements. We have several actions in our under our connected objective, dealing specifically with bicycle facilities, and understanding that to support bicycling, it's not just about putting in those those bike lanes, which are incredibly important, but it's also providing those end of trip facilities, bike racks, but also longer range storage facilities, showers potentially in larger developments. And so those types of requirements are in the UDO, in the zoning general development standards requirements. And depending on the size of the development, it would change how much exactly a site would have to do, but everyone would be required to do some kind of bike parking on their site, as long as they're meeting a certain trigger. And again, yeah, the SMP has several actions that are supporting those types of requirements. And, as we implement these plans and we get the UDO adopted, that's something we can continue to look at to make sure that it's achieving what we want it to achieve. The requirements in the UDO are kind of they're the ordinance, they're the code that development has to follow, and we're creating that policy to support that. So if we're realizing that those requirements are not doing enough to meet the intent of our policies, and that's something that we would look at in the future to fix and amend as well.
Another aspect of that too, from the public investment and back to this connection with the bus priority network and the focus corridors, the notion that Julian kind of referred to about the mobility hub. So, the thought there is there are some key station connections and prominent mobility hubs where certainly bike parking is part of that. So as Julian described, our bike priority network connects to that sort of bus priority network, and we need to have the facilities in those hubs to make that connection easier. And then, things like shared, the expansion of shared bike services and having those kinds of facilities and some of those key mobility hubs does the other way. So it's essentially expanding the connectivity from the transit station using some of the emerging technology and emerging services that are providing even micro mobility kind of first last mile connections.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I mean, the whole conversation for the bus party was not just about corridors and frequency. But there's some real need for capital improvements at the bus stop level, but also identification of mobility hubs throughout the county, because CATS does serve the entire county. So we identified over 50 locations throughout the county with numerous within the city of Charlotte for these mobility hub locations that would be either at the end of line of bus routes, but also mid routes where two routes cross one another. So you can effectively have better transfer between just two bus routes, but also where you can really create that 10-minute mobility need within a neighborhood that gets to the bicycle connections, gets to the scooter connections by enabling space that can be programmed for those types of elements to occur. And then also what could occur there is also this micro transit need with first last mile connections, either through partnering with our Lyft and Uber type providers, but also an on-demand fleet that CATS is looking to deploy in those micro transit zones. And all that was a part of the bus priority study.
This is Julian. I'm just going to add one more thing because I think this is a great topic. And I was thinking back to that relationship between land use and mobility. And I just wanted to point out that there's a strong relationship between how we're looking at corridors and then the place types that have been, the foundation was set within the comprehensive plan. And those place types are then creating the framework for these zoning districts themselves. And so requirements for things like bike parking are going to be potentially higher, along with other multimodal requirements in the place types that are kind of higher intensity, like our centers, like Uptown, like South Park. And so the way what we're trying to support the UDO is to make sure that those types of requirements kind of align with the place types and the corridors, and that everything is integrated well.
Jason, you just mentioned capital improvements at bus stops. So we have quite a few questions about ADA accessibility. And does the city have an ADA transition plan? And how is it addressed in the strategic mobility plan in transportation and in transit?
So I can start with how we're addressing that with the bus stops. I'm sure Jillian can follow up with that. The city has been going through an ADA transition plan, and as part of that effort, identified what would be required for each stop to be 100% accessible. So we have information that has been provided to us what would be needed to do at each bus stop. And it's through the bus priority study, we are updated our design standards to include what we need to do from a capital standpoint, from say bus pads or the approach to the bus stops for that to occur. But I think also what's important to note that as far as amenities at the bus stop, our current policy at the Metropolitan Transit Commission is that bus stops of more than 25 boardings or more would be qualified for a bus shelter. Through the bus priority study, we identified a new strategy to broaden the definition of what amenity standards could be at each bus stop, and looked at things as far as wait time, proximity to land uses such as education opportunities, hospitals, senior citizen centers, and to expand what it means to get amenities across our system. We'll be updating our policies so it's not totally ridership based, but more equitable based to ensure that we put more amenities throughout our system.
And I'll just add the notion of an ADA transition plan, essentially the infrastructure we need to put in place to make our system, particularly our sidewalks and street system, accessible, is above and beyond the requirements that we have. And certainly we're required to do that. It's even more important to us. So that's a basic goal of this plan is making sure that our infrastructure is accessible and safe. And so you'll see that embedded in our policies. You'll see that embedded in some of the prioritization that we have. And certainly we have documented all of those needs across our city, and we're working pretty actively to incrementally make the investments we need to make. We've embedded that in even some of the development requirements we have through that CTR again, to make sure that we can partner in the right ways. So not only are we investing in that upgrade to our infrastructure from a public standpoint, but certainly we're partnering where it makes sense with private development.
Okay, we have a comment and a question about how Vision Zero is a very important part of the strategic mobility plan. What tools are being considered beyond lowering speed limits to increase safety? And are there any traffic calming measures considered in the plan?
That's a great question. I'll start. Maybe Julian, you can jump in as well. So again, I'll mention Vision Zero and the action plan we have around that, and the investment that council has supported, and that has, it goes back to, I think, 2018, 2017. And so we've been committed to that over the last several years. And again, this plan is hopefully just taking that to a new level and embedding it in everything we do. And so there is a sort of a toolkit, and it's not just about speed. Traffic calming is a part of that. And so we have a traffic calming program and a policy around how we do that in neighborhoods. And that includes, the speed cushions and the other things that we can do in our neighborhood streets, and even some cases 4-way stops. So there's a whole menu of things that we do certainly in the neighborhoods to make them safe. We have lots of investment we do with pedestrian crossings on big corridors to make sure that we've got lots of places that are safe and easy to cross our streets. And so there's a menu, you'll see that embedded in the plan with some specifics, both in the policy part, and then you'll see that in the strategy section where we've identified and have worked to kind of prioritize how we would make those improvements throughout our city.
I'll just quickly add, this is Julian Burton again. And we realize that this is an important topic. Through our initial engagement with the communities, this is a comment that came up quite a bit. And although we do have a lot of traffic calming measures in place, we realize that we need to look closer at that. And one of the actions within our SAFE objective in our policy framework is to look at expanding that toolbox as well, and not just settle for what we have now, but continue to look at improving traffic calming. We do realize that it's a really important issue for our community.
Did the city create a list of corridors eligible for road diets or conversions?
Great question. And as many of you know, I think Charlotte has a great history of doing that. In fact, going back, I don't know, 10, 15 years, East Boulevard and several others, Charlotte has always been really on the national forefront of that thinking. And so we've done some great examples of that. And, for those who are not familiar with that notion, it's essentially looking at the curb to curb dimensions of our streets and where it makes sense, reallocating that space. So in many cases, we've been able to take, 4-lane streets, convert them to what we would call 3-lane streets, where you got a travel lane in each direction and a space in the center for turns, for turning movements. And then the gain space you get out of that, we can, in some cases, put bicycle lanes or protected bicycle facilities. So we go back to that notion of complete streets and priorities. Those are places where we can rebalance the mode kind of split of the road itself, and making sure that we get facilities that are multimodal. Question is, do we have a list? That's really back to this notion of what we'll be doing next. We've got that strategy around complete streets in our plan. And so one of the next things to do is really to focus on those corridors and identify the ones that are the best candidates for that road diet kind of conversion.
With respect to Vision Zero, why not have more high intensity activated crosswalk signals to calm traffic and control speed?
Great question. I think if you talk about some of the things that you've seen around the city in terms of examples where we've done pedestrian crossings, we've got a couple of variations. One where you actually have a signal essentially that stops traffic. Another one that essentially has some signals that just alert traffic to the crossings. And so again, back to our strategy in and around the pedestrian infrastructure, you'll see in the draft plan is we've got, now there's a great example where we do have a list of some of those priorities already. And so one of the things we're doing both with our investment through Vision Zero and just the development we partner with as development happens around our activity centers and corridors, we are finding those locations and building them where we can. And so again, that's a great example. It's not just about the sidewalks and traveling along a street, but certainly getting across the street, doing those investments where there's existing bus stops or even the planned future mobility hubs. We know that we've got to make sure that you can travel across the street to get between bus stops or mobility hubs and make our system safe and accessible for all modes.
And this is Julian Burton. I'll add to that quickly. Going back to our streets map, you know, and the cross sections that we're proposing throughout the city for our arterial streets. In a lot of cases, we're recommending center space to be there, and a lot of the time that's used, you know, for turn lanes, whether that's protected or just to separate the street or separate traffic. But that also provides opportunities for pedestrian refuges. When people are crossing the street, it means for larger streets, they're able to stop halfway, and it just makes it safer all around. And so as we're trying to move towards those multimodal cross sections, the center space will also be helpful for pedestrian safety.
We'll do one final question here. How does the plan address emerging mobility technology?
This is Julian Burton again. I think one of the key ways is we actually have a policy and an objective related to just innovative, and we want to basically stay as adaptable as we can and think ahead to autonomous vehicles, think ahead to emerging micromobility options. And one thing I mentioned, and I'll just reiterate again, is we see creating safe and accessible bike infrastructure as also supporting emerging micromobility, whether that's electric skateboards or e-scooters. And what that does is it creates an opportunity to utilize those types of transportation, but it also separates those types of transportation from pedestrians. Because I know one of the complaints now as we're starting to just try and deal with new emerging technologies and new emerging micromobility like e-scooters is that there's conflicts along sidewalks. And that can happen with bikes as well. If cyclists are feeling unsafe on the street, a lot of the time they'll go to the sidewalk. And so by creating a better multimodal street, including bike facilities, then we're going to be able to account for those types of technology and those types of emerging mobility solutions. And also with the streets map has a cross section, but what we're also doing is preserving the space and acquiring space through development for future streets. And maybe streets have different needs 20 years from now. And so by getting that right of way and protecting that space now, we're going to be able to be adaptable in the future as mobility needs change over time.
I'll just put a quick plug in for some things that we're already doing and want to expand on. You'll see this in our plan policies and some of our actions is there's a number of things that are almost invisible in terms of how we think about technology and the future of how we will operate and move our system. And so again, the things you don't see that we're currently investing in, our signals are interconnected and have the technology available for them to connect both to our system and ultimately connect to, you know, the emerging mobility options that are out there. We've just recently are about to institute a pilot in South End where we've got and are partnering with a company that has an app that allows a pedestrian with a phone and that app to connect to and understand and sort of communicate from a technology standpoint between our signals so that we can then use our signals as a way to kind of communicate both to vehicles and pedestrians, adapt how they operate to kind of deal with that mobility. And so technology is a big part of that. And we've got some great ways that we're thinking about that in the long term.
And I'll just add one more final piece. So like Ed's piece, that is really where all the transit and this really comes together as emerging mobility needs. It's a space that I think helps us like work together effectively. And it really does come down to space, creating space for all the modes, whatever the mode may be it, you know, future BRT lines, it's identified in the bus priority study, but also emerging mobility needs that we need for bike and bed and for microtransit, autonomous vehicles that Julian mentioned, and it all could come together at the mobility hubs and making sure that space is available. That's where that new technology can really truly be integrated.
Well, we want to thank you for such great questions. I believe we got through all the ones that were sent to us in the chat, and there were a few comments sent directly to us. So thank you. We've noted those and we appreciate you giving those to us. We've included the link to the public input website in the chat, and we hope that you'll visit the site and leave more feedback there. And as a reminder, there's another opportunity for public comment during the City Council business meeting on June 13th. So thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a great day.